I want to be able to speak with you on a wide range of issues around how the foundation sees the progress in the financial services industry and some of the initiatives that you're working on. And I want to sort of draw a dotted line into all that is happening, that is being called innovation in financial services today. And you're the best person to speak to on this because you've seen both sides of the equation. You've seen the financial institutions, and now you're running a foundation working from the grassroots up, helping societies build their financial infrastructure, right? So tell us what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is doing in financial services today.
So indeed, there is today 1.7 billion people on the planet who are still unbanked. It's an ugly word to describe a person generally poor, generally rural based, that only has cash as a way to transact for day-to-day financial transactions. If you take Africa as a continent, 400 million African adults are in this situation today. Poor rural persons. So the goal of financial services for the poor is to connect these people to the economy by helping financial service providers provide the adequate financial services, including payments to these people, so that they can improve their lives in terms of the security, in terms of managing their money better, in terms of escaping from poverty. That is essentially the goal. Connect them so that they can use digital financial services to improve their lives. We know from many types of research that giving them this access improves considerably their capacity to absorb shocks than dealing with cash, either positive things like marriages or shocks like death or accidents. And we also know that having an electronic digital way to access financial services enables them to save money better and also to essentially manage their lives better. It is unfortunate to say, Emmanuel, but it's very expensive to be poor and to be in this situation because basically you have to expend energy or pay to pay. If you want to go to pay the tuition of a child, sometimes you may have to walk 5 kilometers to actually hand out the cash.
Yeah, so there are three aspects of financial services. One is payments or access to financial infrastructure. Second would be credit. And third would be wealth creation. That's how financial services configured in the commercial sense. First question I have for you is what is the size of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation today, and how much of that is dedicated funding for what you do, financial services?
Yes, the Gates Foundation annual impact budget is in excess of $3.5 billion. Financial services for the poor is a relatively small strategy, about $130 million. But it is a strategy that has its own objectives, but it's also transversal because we support other strategies, because many other strategies need essentially payments for them to work.
How the Gates Foundation works, is there a virtuous connectivity between the different programs or the different areas that you work in?
Yes, there is common objectives, and the best example that was perhaps even amplified by the COVID pandemic is the need for governments to be able to pay to support various people, and either people who work in the agricultural sector or who are poor. And so digitizing the government payments is a very transversal strategy that touches many of the things that we do at the Gates Foundation.
So if I were to ask you to prioritize the top 3 or 5 projects that you're working on, what would they be?
In the financial services for the poor, we are focused on infrastructure to make financial inclusion happen, one. And secondly, we are focused on gender aspects, because one of the facts also is that there is a huge gender gap in access to financial services or mobile phone technology, and that is a barrier we need to overcome. On the infrastructure side, what we believe is that the best way to enable the scaling of the effort to cover 1.7 billion people ultimately is to deploy national or even regional digital payment platforms that interconnect all of the players on the ground in a real-time retail payment system where money can flow from one person to the other instantaneously in real time at a super cheap processing cost. The other important infrastructure that is very much connected to payments is digital identity. So in the process of onboarding the 1.7 billion people, how do you manage the identity piece of this and the associated KYC aspects of this? So our basic effort is to help the national stakeholders like governments, central banks, private sector banks and providers to collaborate to deploy this infrastructure that then enables a country-wide or even regional-wide platform to serve the poor. To give you a few examples of such endeavors, for example, we are assisting the Central Bank of Pakistan to deploy what they call MPG, which is a mobile payment gateway, which is a country-wide real-time payment platform that interconnects all of the financial service providers in the country, banks, but also the digital financial service providers like mobile money or others in one single platform, with the effect that one person who has a mobile wallet on a mobile phone can participate in the economy by receiving money from other wallets, paying money from her wallet to a bank account, and all of the combinations thereof, including paying to merchants. Another example we have on a regional level in Africa is in Western Africa. There is an economic and monetary union of 8 countries called WAEMU. They share a single currency and they have a single central bank. And we are helping the central bank there, in association with the African Development Bank, deploy such a platform on a regional level.
The two that you've just described sounds like programs that should be funded by the World Bank, for example, rather than by an impact agency. So where do you draw the line between what needs to be done commercially and what needs to be done as an impact agenda?
We work a lot, of course, on the ground with the World Bank teams. What we actually, with our strength at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is to foster innovation. And these real-time payment platform, as you know, when we got to know each other some 7-8 years ago, there was no real-time payment platforms anywhere. Today, this is becoming common, and I would dare to say that Africa and Asia are actually leading the way in deploying real-time payment platforms. So we are at the forefront of these projects, where we help create the architecture and lead these projects to deployment. After that, the operation of this project gets into the more traditional financing model that we all know well.
But do you fund existing programs or do you initiate your own programs, put your own people on the ground and stuff?
So we do 3 things. We provide philanthropic capital, which is a grant. So we don't expect that this money is returned. We fund it for impact. We provide technical assistance because deploying such platforms actually requires skills. And then we provide assets. And one of the assets is an open source software that's called Mojaloop that we have commissioned the development of. And that is actually an open source free software that that people can use to create these platforms without having to reinvent the wheel of technology. The software is essentially a reference implementation for an interoperable payment platform. This is something that my team has developed with some fintech companies and now has been spun off into its own foundation, the Mojaloop Foundation, where we are partnering with other philanthropic organizations like Omidyar and Rockefeller, but also where we have Google partnering with us and PhonePe from India partnering with us. To sum up, we provide a number of assistance, philanthropic capital, technical assistance, assets to the stakeholders on the ground. So they carry out the projects. We help them with these various ways that I mentioned.
So in the area of payments, there are any number of payment initiatives in any country, in the UK, in Southeast Asia, in China, in Africa. And it used to be that payments was, even for rich people, even for the people with access to finance, payments used to be an expensive idea. But over time, technology has made payment, the cost of building a payments platform, it just collapsed. So in fact, if you look at the annual reports of Visa and MasterCard, they don't make money from processing anymore because the three core revenues, the most important is marketing. In fact, they outsource a lot of their processing down to the regional levels. And you know, they also outsourced it to Wirecard, which then outsourced it to other subprime processing companies because the payments became a volume game. It's a game that the commercial institutions were not making money on it anymore.
Yeah.
So the idea of making payments cheap or accessible to poor people or people without access to infrastructure has become a lot easier. So when a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation goes into a country like Indonesia and looks at payments, what do you see? How do you engage? And what are your priorities as a result?
Yeah. So we are driven by the needs of serving the poor. So the question we need to ask is, how does a payment platform need to look like to be usable, accepted by the poorest on the planet? If you want to serve the poor, there are a number of characteristics that are required. One, the payment needs to be instantaneous between parties, even if they are not on the same network. The interoperability is a huge need because if people can only transact on the same network, even very cheap, they can only do so much. And the needs of the poor are much broader than this. So having an interoperable, instantaneous payment platform that is super cheap, that is an innovation. That didn't exist a few years ago. And that's where we are at in order to serve the poor. For example, what Mojaloop is a good example of. How do you do that? And secondly, if you think about a merchant transaction, not only it needs to be instantaneous, but it needs to be irrevocable. Because the merchant, you pay with your phone, you walk away with the goods. There is no way now to undo this transaction and so on. And then on the payment platform side, we consider the payment platforms that need to be run like a utility, essentially not for profit, or I call it a little bit different. I call it not for loss. So essentially, all the profit that is made needs to be reinvested in the platform so that the platform can absorb the volume, but also be super secure and reliable. So we consider that a payment platform needs to be accessible for competitive offerings. And to be efficient for this, these platforms need to be processed at humongous number of transactions of very small value. Like in East Africa, one of the innovations that happened was the sale of solar batteries, where people can actually lease the solar battery and pay every day a small amount. A good example of where this gets would certainly be the UPI in India. They just run over 2 billion transactions per month with an exponential growth rate.
There are any number of players playing in exactly the field that you've just described. There are fintech startups, there are the traditional banks, in some cases central bank currencies and so on. Some of them are conflicting, but some of them are competing. I do believe that a number of players, when they say that they want to make payments more accessible to the poor, actually all they are doing is trying to extend their customer base to be a profitable business. But on the other hand, the cost of payments has been collapsing. And in fact, this initiative where you have the open source platform that you've just described collapses the cost even more. There's this competitive dynamics taking place in the area of payments at the moment. And you seem to be working with central banks, but not necessarily at the commercial layer. What happens when you come across a country like Indonesia or China, which already has commercial platforms that provide this ubiquity?
At the country level, you make sure that there is a level playing field for everyone, and that there is a platform that is run as a utility. Because if you have platforms run for profit, then basically you create again silos that don't talk to each other. And so I think the governments and central banks, they have this view that interoperability is very important from the consumer perspective at the end of the day. It's great to have innovation on rails, payment rails, but it's also important that you ensure that from a consumer perspective, that there is like a uniform environment where you are not taxed.
Does the Gates Foundation take a stake in fintechs and startups?
We have one example. We invested in bKash in Bangladesh early on, but this is not our general model. Our more general model is grants to either like central banks or associations. Like, for example, we work with SADC in SADC, the Southern African Development Community. We work with the banking association there. And so we help them financially and technically to enhance the existing CIRES system in South Africa, to extend to digital financial service providers, mobile money providers, and multiple currencies.
What is your position on emerging technologies like blockchain and so on?
We have a very specific focus on looking at new technologies, both on the identity and payment side, and blockchain obviously is one of these. We tend to take what's best and put it to use. So, for example, Mojeloop is based on a component called Interledger Protocol that borrows a lot of blockchain concepts, can connect a traditional payment system with a blockchain-based system, but it's not a blockchain in itself. We look at technologies like cryptocurrencies, more in the context of central bank currencies, the digital currencies for settlement. We have not engaged in cryptocurrencies as being directly useful for use by the poorest, for many reasons. First, because many of the people I mentioned, they don't have smartphones, so they are just not equipped with the power to deal with the crypto, but also because we follow the concept of the fact that every payment platform in the country must be fully regulated, and hence the local currencies is used, because basically that is what the stakeholders we help, they want.
If you take distressed countries like Mozambique and Venezuela and so on, the poor get right into crypto because it's a matter of survival for them. In distressed situations, the desperately poor cannot wait, and they need to make decisions. Your programs appear to be moving more toward the established infrastructure and not taking a view of circumstances where the desperately poor define their own currency, define their own response, what they need to do.
I agree that we work with incumbents, but at the same time, we want to ensure that the people using this at the end of the day are protected, the system is secure, that the system is not used for fraud, money laundering. And that's why it's important that what we do is in conjunction with regulations, but we also work with regulators to, of course, take into account the innovations and implement them in the countries as the innovations are coming. And that's a huge part of our work too.
What is the position of the foundation to central bank digital currency?
Right now, the view that based on our research is that CBDC-based settlement is something that is quite interesting, because one of the frictions in an interoperable system is inter-provider settlements. If I send you an instantaneous payment, you receive it. But if you and I are on a different provider, then our two providers have to settle between them. And that process today can prove to be a friction, depending on the setup of the particular country or central bank. And it could be that the research showed that CBDC could be something that can remove that friction.
Would you provide funding for developing countries to set up their own central bank digital currency?
We actually haven't received yet any demand for such assistance. And if it comes, we will look at it in the context of gradual adoption, perhaps looking at settlement. But the extreme scenario of CBDC being available all the way down to the users is an interesting case. A lot more research needs to be done on how useful is it, what are the on-ramps, off-ramps to cash, because cash is still needed.
Actually, a lot has already happened. I think one of the earliest central bank digital currency was Uruguay, and then now Sweden, and then of course China. So there are enough case studies now, and actually the technology is a lot simpler than we imagine it to be. Wouldn't that be the simplest, fastest mode of deploying payments infrastructure? Takes care of all the interoperability issues that you've been talking about, and there it also fits your model of working with the policymakers.
So again, you have to look at this as obvious as it could appear to us. I think you have to ask yourself the questions of how useful and how impactful is this to the poorest, which is a quite different thing. Are they equipped to deal with cryptocurrency at all? Like, do they have a smartphone? The smartphones are getting cheaper and so on, but by all means, not every of these 1.7 billion people will have a smartphone anytime soon. So that's kind of basic problem number one. And by the way, a smartphone requires charging every day. Bar phone, you charge it once every week or 2 weeks, and you can still transact with it. One other thing is the on and off ramps. So it's great you receive some CBDC version of a rupee on your phone, but if you can't do anything with it and you can't cash it out, what good is it for you? We all see the possible usefulness of this, but before you actually take the drastic step of helping deploy such a technology on a super large scale at 2 billion transactions per month, that's quite a different endeavor.
Let me test you on two more points. The profit pools in traditional payments infrastructure. One is the interchange and the other is foreign exchange, FX.
Yeah.
The cross-border initiatives that you have, FX is a big thing. It's almost no innovation in payment would get into payments if it wasn't for the FX. And even when they collapse the FX from the traditional banks, what the banks charge, it is still very profitable. It's still the defining reason for being in cross-border payments. Are you saying that anyone who is in payments for the poor cannot be profitable? It's a utility, and therefore there is no income, and therefore you either have to totally dismantle both FX and interchange. Because you need a system that actually completely dismantles both. Is that how you think about cross-border payments?
Yeah. So I'm not saying that at all. Actually, I mentioned this. There are two different layers of services. There is the payment rails, which is typically collaborative and not for loss. And then there are the competitive offerings of accounts, wallets, and services. For example, like the first mobile money implementation in Africa, in Kenya, M-Pesa, more than 10 years ago, they have proven two things. One, that it's useful for the poor. Secondly, that money can be made by providing such services to the poor. And so and today there are more than 250 mobile money operations across every Africa. This is a great innovation. The only issue so far is that each one of these mobile money operations is a silo. It's not interoperable. So the next wave of innovation is this payment platform that interconnects them all. So we are not saying that they should provide services for free, but we ensure at least that the platform that interconnects them all is super efficient, provided as a utility. And so the interchange fee between providers is super low, if not zero, but they are still charging their customers in the way they see fit for the product target and so on. Same for cross-border transactions. When you have two such platforms in two neighbor countries, then you can imagine that you can interconnect them through value-added Forex providers. So we are not taking away by this any business. What we are making sure is that the infrastructure that connects them is super efficient. We do hope that they make their customers benefit from the savings they do because of the lower interchange rate.
Do you have initiatives in community currencies? Because I would imagine that if you have cross functionalities with other parts of the foundation, community currencies appear to be not only being a payment platform or a payment token, it actually monetizes activity, and makes communities sustainable. Do you have a view on that? Are you encouraging it? Are you funding any of these community currencies?
We are not funding any that I know. This is an innovation that we are favorable to. We see them as a great education tool for financial, literacy. Great example are, especially in Asia, the very small credit unions, of which there are many in Indonesia, Philippines. They are a great enabler of financial services for the poor, but they suffer greatly because they are isolated. They are not connected to the greater payment system of the country, of the planet. We work with the World Council of Credit Union, the Asian Council of Credit Unions, so that the credit unions organize themselves in platforms as well, that they can be then connected to larger national or regional platforms. So we see that as a great enabler from grassroots financial literacy and inclusion, and that can then grow into these bigger platforms that we do.
Give me a sense of what
Yeah.
the foundation is doing in the area of credit.
So as I mentioned, we consider that accounts and wallet provision is a commercial endeavor and we encourage many providers to play on the playing field. The same is for what I would call the new Ubers, the applications. Of course, credit is the basic one. In Kenya, there are several credit systems that are connected to the mobile money system of the country. We are again encouraging partners to foster innovation on creating fintech or great other ideas for these applications. One example I mentioned earlier is Mkopa Solar, which is a company that provides these solar batteries, and that essentially invented a new way. Because when you look at the poor households, it's not that they don't have money, they do, but they can only spend so much at a particular time. As a Kenyan household, you can't buy a solar battery because it's like a huge expense, but you can pay $1 a day, to actually slowly but surely get ownership. And
Right.
that would not be possible without a payment platform that is capable of processing humongous amounts of transactions of $1 or less a day. And so the platform is making this possible. And these new Ubers, as I call them, for financial services, we hope to see many of them in the transportation space, in agriculture space, in energy space. This is a huge innovation space, which we are interested to see flourish. And we work with other partners to incentivize this innovation.
Why doesn't the foundation take a stake in specific projects or specific
Because
startups?
our theory of change is that helping deploy these digital platforms is the best way to scale it and the best way to give floor to these innovators. That's what we choose to invest on. Many other philanthropies are active in many other of these spaces. Many venture capitalists are invested. There is a lot of money for innovation, and we think that this is not a space where we will make an impact. We really think that our impact is this huge scale of getting 1.7 billion people connected.
What is the KPI of the financial services sector, portion of
Yes.
the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation?
So how many people get connected? How many people use the system? How many women have reached the system, and not only men? Closing the gender gap.
Kosta, it's been really wonderful speaking to you.